October brought with it a thick, dry air. The wind no longer blew with the heat of summer. Instead, a sharp chill crept through my fingers, signaling the coming decay. I took this seasonal job because I needed the money, and also for a touch of foolish romanticism. Black Creek Farm, with its giant corn maze famous throughout the region, seemed like the perfect place to escape the noisy city. My job was quite simple: sell tickets, guide lost families, and most importantly, take one final walk through the maze before closing to make sure no one was left inside. The first few weeks passed peacefully. The laughter of children echoed between the towering walls of corn, the scent of apple pie and roasted pumpkin filled the air, and when the sun went down, a pleasant silence enveloped everything. There were 4 of us working here: the owner, a cheerful, plump man named Henderson, a girl named Chloe who worked at the food stand, and Silas. Silas was the only one who made me feel uneasy. He didn't talk much. In fact, he barely said anything at all. He was tall and thin, with dark, always messy hair, and eyes that constantly stared into some unseen distance. He did the heavy labor, fixing fences, cleaning up, and sometimes standing guard at the maze entrance. But most of the time, I saw him just standing there, silently, his gaze fixed on the endless rows of corn. Henderson said he was a local, a boy from a difficult background, but a very hard worker. My unease began with trivial things. One afternoon, during my final check, I found a child's shoe lying forlornly in the middle of a path. It wasn't a recently dropped shoe. It was worn, caked with hardened mud, as if it had been there for a very long time. I picked it up, took it back to the office, and asked everyone, but no one recognized it. Henderson just shrugged, assuming it belonged to a tourist from a previous season. Then a few days later, I found a rusty hair clip. After that, a metal button tarnished with time. Small, harmless objects, but their presence in the most remote parts of the maze sent a shiver down my spine. They didn't seem like things people accidentally drop. They seemed like forgotten traces. I began to dread the end-of-day checks. As the sun started to sink behind the trees, the maze transformed into a completely different world. The pale yellow light of dusk filtered through the gaps in the corn leaves, creating long, distorted shadows that danced on the ground. The wind rustled through, creating an incessant whispering sound like thousands of secret murmurs. All my senses were on high alert. Every crunch of a dry leaf underfoot, every rustle of stalks rubbing against each other made me jump. I always had the feeling I wasn't alone. The feeling that a pair of eyes was following my every move from deep within the darkness of the corn rows. I tried to reassure myself that it was just my imagination. This job left me alone too much. But the feeling grew stronger. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I would catch a flicker of movement, a shadow darting quickly around a turn up ahead. When I ran to the spot, there were only silent corn stalks swaying in the wind. One evening, after making sure no one was left inside, I was on my way back out when I heard a sound. It wasn't the wind. It was a very faint dragging sound, coming from an area I knew for sure was a dead end. My heart pounded in my chest. I hid behind a corner, trying to hold my breath and listen. The sound came again, a little closer. I didn't dare to look. I turned and ran, not daring to look back, just sprinting straight for the exit, where the safe electric lights were shining. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of Silas kept swirling in my head, the way he stared at the maze, his almost absolute silence. I wondered what he did after work. Where did he live? No one knew. Halloween was just a few days away, and a major storm was forecast to hit that very night. Henderson decided to close early to secure everything. He assigned Silas and me the task of checking all the support poles and ropes inside the maze to ensure they were strong enough to withstand the high winds. Going into the maze with Silas was the last thing I wanted to do, but I couldn't refuse. We split up, each taking a different section. I tried to work as quickly as possible, just wanting to get out of there. While checking a rope in the western section, I noticed a small path I had never seen before. It wasn't on the map, cleverly hidden by densely grown corn stalks. Curious and perhaps foolishly, I decided to go in and see. The path was narrow and dark. After walking for about a few dozen meters, I smelled a foul odor, a musty, rank smell of decay. I covered my nose with my hand and kept going. The path led me to a small clearing surrounded on all sides by thick corn walls. And there I saw it. A makeshift shelter built from tattered tarps, rotten wooden planks, and dry corn stalks. Around the shelter was a messy pile of junk, but as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't junk. There was a faded hiking backpack, some old clothes, and a collection of strange items. The child's shoe I had found, the rusty hair clip, dozens of other personal belongings, an empty wallet, a lighter, a wristwatch with a broken face. The blood in my veins turned to ice. This wasn't a temporary shelter. This was a lair. Someone had been living here, right in the heart of the maze. And then I saw something stuck in a wooden post next to the shelter. A pair of pruning shears, the kind we used at the farm. The blades were unusually shiny, as if they were cleaned and sharpened every day. I remembered the shears that had gone missing from the shed a few weeks ago. I had to get out of here, immediately. I carefully backed away, trying not to make any noise. But when I turned around, Silas was standing there, right at the entrance to the trail. He just stood there, silent as always, blocking my only escape. But this time, his eyes were no longer staring into the void. He was looking straight at me. A hollow, soulless gaze, yet it held a terrifying focus. He wasn't surprised to see me here. He had known. Perhaps he had led me here. He didn't say a word, just quietly advanced toward me. Survival instincts kicked in. I screamed and lunged toward the opposite wall of corn, hoping to break through it to escape. The hard, rough stalks scratched my skin, but I didn't care. I just rammed into them, using all my strength to create a path. And then the chase began. The sky had turned a gloomy gray, and the wind had started to blow harder. The maze was now his territory. I was just a weak intruder. I ran without direction, just turning down any path that appeared before me. The sound of his footsteps echoed behind me, steady, not fast, not slow, a deadly rhythm that showed no sign of fatigue. He didn't need to rush. He knew this place better than the back of his hand. He knew every corner, every turn, every dead end. I could hear the rustling of the corn rows as he moved through them, sometimes to my right, sometimes to my left. He was toying with me. He was hurting me deeper inside. I tried to recall the map, tried to locate the sun's direction, but it was all useless. Every path looked identical. The towering green-gold walls of corn were like the walls of a giant prison. Rain began to fall, at first just a light drizzle, then quickly becoming heavy. The rain lashed at my face, blurring my vision. The mud underfoot made every step heavy. I stumbled, my knee hitting the ground hard. I scrambled back up, not daring to waste a second. When I glanced back, I saw his silhouette, just a few rows of corn away, closing in. The blade of the pruning shears in his hand glinted coldly in the dim twilight. In desperation, I did something crazy. Instead of continuing straight, I made a sharp turn, squeezing between two rows of corn, forcing my way through a non-existent path. Branches and leaves whipped at my face and arms, but I pushed forward. I hoped this surprise move might help me lose him. I stopped, hiding behind a large stalk, and listened. There was only the sound of the falling rain and the howling wind. No more footsteps. Maybe I had succeeded. I panted, trying to regain my composure. I had to find my way out. The main exit, where there were lights and people. I moved cautiously, trying to go in the direction I guessed was the exit. The storm had truly arrived. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the entire maze for a brief moment. And in that moment, my heart nearly stopped. He was standing at the end of the path, less than 20 meters away, waiting. He had known I would take this path. I had no way out. I let out a scream and ran toward him, not to attack, but to get past him. As I lunged closer, he swung his arm. I felt a sharp, hot pain in my own arm. I staggered but didn't fall, just kept pushing forward. I ran past him, feeling his cold breath on the back of my neck. I didn't dare look down at my arm. I just ran. The lights of the farm appeared in the distance, blurry through the rain. It was my only hope. I summoned my last bit of strength, burst out of the maze, and collapsed onto the soaked grass. I scrambled up and ran toward the main house, screaming as I went. Henderson and Chloe rushed out, their faces pale as they saw my condition and the blood streaming down my arm. I only managed to stammer out 2 words, "Silas, maze," before I collapsed. The police arrived. They searched the maze all night in the storm. They found the shelter, the gruesome collection of items. They found my blood trail. The howling storm didn't stop them. With police dogs, they scoured every path, every corner. It wasn't until near dawn, when the storm had weakened, that a police dog started barking loudly in the eastern section, where there was an old ditch. They found him there, huddled under a tarp to the bone and shivering from the cold. The pruning shears were still clutched tightly in his hand. He didn't resist arrest, remaining eerily silent, his empty eyes staring out into the rain. I left Black Creek right after that. The wound on my arm eventually healed, leaving a long scar. Silas was convicted of multiple crimes. The newspapers called him the Corn Maze Ghost. They discovered that the items he collected belonged to various people who had gone missing in the area over the years. They were tourists, like hikers, people who had taken a wrong turn and never came back. Every time autumn comes, every time I smell the damp earth after a rain or hear the rustle of dry leaves in the wind, I shudder. He is behind bars, but that doesn't lessen my fear. I'm no longer afraid of ghosts or supernatural forces. I'm afraid of people. I'm afraid of silence, afraid of the empty spaces in a person's story, and afraid of what might be lurking just behind the next row of trees. Because I know Silas isn't the only one. There are other figures in other places silently watching and waiting. The city welcomed us with a gentle October afternoon. The air carried the dryness of rotten leaves and the faint smell of smoke from invisible chimneys, a characteristic scent of autumn that I was not yet familiar with. Clara and I, having just escaped 4 years of university, used our entire savings to rent an attic apartment in an old, worn-out brick building. It wasn't anything beautiful, but it was ours, a starting line in this concrete maze. From the kitchen window, we could see the tree canopies turning a withered yellow, leaves drifting down onto the pavement with each gust of wind. The new life began with a promising rhythm. During the day, I worked at a small coffee shop, trying to turn my literature degree into something more useful than an expensive paperweight. Clara, meanwhile, interned at an art gallery downtown. In the evenings, we often went for walks, watching the city's neon lights reflecting on the remaining rain puddles, feeling the overwhelming freedom. Everything began in a very trivial way, easily dismissed as a random coincidence. It was when I was on the subway returning home after a long shift. The train car was crowded, stuffy with human breath and the smell of damp clothes. When the train stopped at a station, one stream of people rushed out and another stream pushed in. Through the gap between the backs, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing on the platform, right outside my door. A man wearing a long gray coat, collar turned up covering almost his entire face. The thing that caught my attention was that the person did not get on the train, nor did he leave. He just stood there, motionless as a statue, and seemed to be looking straight at me. The train doors closed. The train rushed into the darkness, and that image vanished. I shook my head, assuming it was just fatigue. A few days later, I saw that coat again. I was walking home, the shortcut through a small, deserted park. The dry yellow leaves rustled underfoot. I had a feeling someone was following me. Not a vague feeling, but a clear awareness of other footsteps strangely synchronizing with my own. When I slowed down, those footsteps also slowed down. When I sped up, it also sped up. My heart started to pound. I glanced quickly over my shoulder. In the distance at the edge of the park, a figure stood silently under an old oak tree. The gray coat. I couldn't see the face clearly, but I knew it was him. I walked very fast, almost running, and didn't dare to look back until I reached my building. I told Clara. She listened, her eyebrows slightly furrowed, then suggested I was too stressed. This city is huge, has millions of people, and bumping into the same person in different places is normal. Maybe that person also lives nearby. Her explanation was reasonable to the point that I almost believed it. I tried to push away the feeling of unease creeping inside me. But then other strange things started to happen, things that couldn't be explained by common logic. One morning, I found a deep red maple leaf placed neatly on the threshold of our apartment. It couldn't have flown there on its own. Our hallway is an enclosed space. Clara thought it was a prank by some kid in the building, but I knew it wasn't. Then came the phone calls. Calls to the apartment's landline, usually in the middle of the night. When I picked up, the other end was just silence. Not the silence of a dead line, but an intentional silence. I could feel someone's presence, feel their held breath. I yelled into the receiver, but there was no reply. Only a heavy silence, lasting until I hung up myself, my hand drenched in sweat. Fear became my constant companion. I started changing my route to work every day. I avoided walking through the park. On the subway, I always stood with my back against the wall, eyes constantly scanning the crowd. Every figure in a gray coat made me flinch. The bustling city now was no longer a symbol of freedom, but a jungle where predators could be hiding anywhere. Clara started to genuinely worry about me. The doubt in her eyes was gradually replaced by pity. She suggested we go somewhere for the weekend, escape the city for a while, but I knew it was useless. The fear wasn't in this city, it was in that figure, and I had a feeling that no matter where I went, he would find me. One Tuesday night, I came home late. Clara was already asleep. I carefully locked the 2 locks on the main door and set the security chain. The apartment was submerged in silence, only the steady ticking of the wall clock in the living room. I sat down tiredly on the sofa, not bothering to turn on the lights. The pale yellow light from the street lamp cast through the window, painting bizarre shadows on the wall. That's when I saw it. Our bedroom window, the one I was sure I had closed tightly before leaving for work, was now open a small crack. A cold draft seeped in, making the curtain flutter slightly. My whole body froze. I had checked all the windows, I always did. It had become an obsessive habit. There was no way I could have forgotten. A horrifying thought ran down my spine. Someone had been in this apartment, or worse, was still here. I held my breath, listening. The ticking of the clock seemed deafeningly loud, the pounding of my heart in my chest. Other than that, nothing. Absolute silence. I slowly stood up, trying not to make a sound. I needed to get to Clara. I tiptoed towards the bedroom. Every step was torture. The old wooden floor creaked lightly under my weight. I gently pushed the bedroom door. Clara was still fast asleep, the duvet pulled up to her chin. I let out a sigh of relief, but then my eyes stopped on the armchair placed in the corner of the room. On the chair, there was something, a red maple leaf identical to the leaf I found in front of the door a few weeks ago. It lay there, glowing red menacingly in the dim light. Panic surged. I rushed to the bedside, shook Clara hard. She mumbled in her sleep. I covered her mouth before she could scream, whispered urgently in her ear, telling her to be quiet and follow me. The fear in my voice must have woken her completely. She nodded, her eyes wide in the darkness. We silently left the bedroom, moving through the living room. Everything seemed normal, but I knew something was wrong. The feeling of being watched had never been so intense. It seemed as if a pair of invisible eyes was following our every move from some dark corner. We were almost at the main door. My hand trembled as I turned the knob. I undid one lock. The second lock. I was sliding the safety chain when a sound came from the kitchen. A very small sound, as if something metal had just been placed lightly on the stone countertop. Both of us froze, petrified. We were no longer alone. Without thinking, I pushed Clara hard out the door, telling her to run. I turned back, facing the darkness of the apartment. I grabbed the heaviest thing within reach, a brass table lamp. "Who's there?" My voice cracked. No answer. Only a waiting silence. I slowly backed towards the door, eyes glued to the darkness at the end of the hallway leading to the kitchen. Then a figure stepped out, tall, thin, wearing the familiar gray coat. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could see his eyes glinting in the faint light from outside. He wasn't holding a weapon. His hands hung loosely at his sides. He started advancing towards me, slowly, steadily. Each of his steps was deliberate, without hesitation. I backed away. "What do you want?" I screamed, my voice full of desperation. The man said nothing, he just continued to get closer. The distance between us narrowed. I could smell him, a musty smell like old clothes and the smell of rotting leaves. When he was only a few steps away, I swung the lamp, attacking with all my strength. But he moved faster than I thought. He dodged it easily, his ice-cold hand grabbed my wrist. His strength was extraordinary. The lamp fell to the floor, making a jarring sound. He pushed me onto the floor. My head hit the wood hard. Everything spun. I looked up, saw his face leaning down close to me. For the first time, I saw him clearly. A completely unfamiliar face. Nothing special. A face you could see anywhere in this city. It was that very normality that made it more horrible. There was no anger or hatred in his eyes, only an emptiness, a cold focus like that of a scientist examining a specimen. But then there were screams from the hallway. The sound of rushing footsteps. Clara had called the police or called the neighbors. The man paused. He glanced towards the door, then back at me. Just a moment's hesitation. Then he turned, without any hurry, walked towards the living room window. He opened it gently, climbed out, and disappeared into the night as if he had never been there. I lay on the floor, trembling, listening to the apartment door being broken down and the neighbors rushing in. They never found him. No fingerprints, no evidence, no witnesses saw him climb out of the building. My story sounded absurd, like a nightmare. A few police officers were sympathetic, but most looked at me with doubtful eyes. Clara was the only one who believed me, but that night's event left an invisible scar between us, an unspoken fear. We moved out the very next week. We left that city, leaving behind the attic apartment and the unfinished dreams. I moved to a small town in the suburbs, a place so quiet you could hear the wind blowing through the fields. I thought I would be safe here, but I was wrong. The horror wasn't in a man in a gray coat. It was in the randomness of it all. It was in the fact that in a world of billions of people, you could be chosen as a target for no reason at all. Sometimes, on autumn afternoons when the leaves start to fall, I get that feeling again, the feeling of being watched. I will look out the window, scanning the empty street. Usually there's no one there, but sometimes in the distance I see a figure standing silently, and on my windowsill someone has left a deep red maple leaf. Autumn was what called me to Ashwood National Forest. I've always been obsessed with the way life immolates itself in a final brilliant blaze before succumbing to winter. A camera, a backpack with enough supplies for 3 days, and myself. That was all I needed. The silence of nature was the antidote to the chaotic sounds of the city. I arrived late one afternoon. The crisp air carried the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. After checking in at the ranger station, I drove a few more miles deeper into the forest to a deserted campsite next to a lake as still as a mirror. The water's surface reflected the maple and oak trees, turning shades of faded yellow, deep crimson, and burnt orange. I pitched my tent, started a small fire, and sat there for hours, just watching the subtle shifts of light as the sun slowly set behind the distant peaks. The first night passed peacefully, with only the chirping of insects and the crackling of the fire. The next morning, I decided to hike a less-traveled trail, hoping to find more pristine scenery. The sun cast slanted rays through the dense canopy, creating a symphony of light and shadow on the forest floor. I was so engrossed in taking pictures, so lost in the beauty of the woods, that I didn't realize I had strayed from the path. Now, all around me were just ancient trees and a thick carpet of leaves underfoot. It was then that I saw it. A symbol carved deep into the bark of an old oak. It was a spiral with a single dot in the center. The carving was fresh. The cut bark was still weeping sap. Curiosity rose, overwhelming my anxiety about being lost. Someone had been here, and not an ordinary tourist. I looked around and spotted a nearly invisible path concealed by low bushes. An unseen force urged me to follow it. The path led me through dense thickets and finally opened into a small, hidden valley. Before me was a small settlement of a few simple log cabins built in harmony with the surrounding landscape. Smoke rose from a chimney, and I could smell burning wood and cooking food. It looked like a small, isolated community, not an entirely uncommon sight in these remote areas. A man emerged from the largest cabin. He looked to be in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a weathered face, but his eyes were unusually bright. He wore simple, earth-toned clothes. "Welcome, brother," he said with a friendly smile. His voice was deep and warm. "What wind has brought you to us?" I explained that I was a photographer who had lost his way. He nodded in understanding and introduced himself as Davis. He said I had stumbled upon the family, a community of people seeking a simpler life in harmony with nature. He invited me to stay for dinner before he showed me the way back. His hospitality put me at ease, and I agreed. The other members of the community gradually appeared. There were old people and children, all exuding a strange sense of peace. They invited me into the communal house, a large space with a stone fireplace in the center. Dinner was vegetable soup and homemade bread. While we ate, Davis and the others spoke of their philosophy of abandoning the noise of the outside world to listen to the heartbeat of the earth. Their words were poetic and seemed sincere. But as I observed more closely, I began to notice unsettling details. Everyone, from Davis to the youngest child, had a spiral tattoo on their wrist, identical to the symbol I saw on the tree. Their smiles, though friendly, never quite reached their eyes. Their gazes held an emptiness, an inward focus that was almost unnerving. When I tried to ask about their pasts, about their lives before coming here, they would answer vaguely or skillfully change the subject. That night, they set me up in a small tent. I lay in my sleeping bag, but couldn't fall asleep. From the direction of the communal house, I heard singing. It wasn't a cheerful campfire song. It was a monotonous, repetitive melody, a wordless chant that was both beautiful and mournful. It went on for hours, seeping into my mind, planting a nameless sense of unease. The next morning, I thanked Davis and said I had to leave. He smiled and said the family always welcomed lost souls, and that I could stay as long as I wished. A young woman named Serafina was sent to show me the way. During the walk, she didn't say a word, only occasionally glancing at me with those vacant eyes. When we reached the familiar trail, she pointed ahead, gave a slight nod, and then turned and walked straight back, disappearing into the trees without a single look back. I could have left right then. I should have. But the photographer's curiosity, the desire to document something unique and mysterious, won over reason. I told myself I would just stay at a distance, observe, and take pictures of them. I returned to my campsite, but the feeling of solitude now had a different color. It was no longer peaceful, but vulnerable. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. The following day, I returned to the vicinity of the valley, hiding on a dense hillside overlooking the settlement. I used my telephoto lens to watch them. Their lives seemed very orderly, gardening, chopping wood, meditating, but I noticed cleansing sessions that took place by the stream. People would submerge themselves in the frigid autumn water until their bodies turned blue and trembled, while Davis stood on the bank, reciting verses I couldn't hear. They did it with a look of resignation, almost bliss. The climax of horror came on the final night. A full moon hung directly overhead, bathing the entire forest in an eerie silver light. The chanting rose again from the communal house, but this time it seemed more urgent, more powerful. I couldn't resist the urge to find out. I cautiously approached the house, hid behind a pile of firewood, and peeked through a crack in the window. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. They weren't meditating. The entire community was standing in a circle around a young man. He was kneeling on the floor, his back bare. Davis stood before him, holding an iron rod heated red hot in the fireplace. On the young man's back were countless old scars, all in the shape of a spiral. Davis began to speak, his voice no longer warm, but steely and resonant. He spoke of sacrifice, of shedding the physical shell to become one with the eternal eye. That eye was the forest, the primordial existence, and pain was the only path to reach it. Then, in almost absolute silence, Davis pressed the red-hot iron against the young man's back. The skin sizzled, and smoke rose with the smell of burning flesh. But the man did not scream. He threw his head back, his face contorting in an expression that was a mixture of supreme agony and ecstasy. The others stared, their eyes glowing in the firelight, their faces devoid of any compassion, only fanatical devotion. I recoiled in horror. My foot snagged on a log, making a small noise. A noise just loud enough to break the deathly silence in the room. The circle broke. All eyes turned toward the window. Davis's gaze met mine for just a moment, but what I saw in it was not surprise, but a cold disappointment, as if I were a lamb who had refused salvation. I turned and ran. I didn't think. I just bolted into the darkness of the forest. The sound of footsteps pursued me. No shouts, just the rhythmic pounding of feet and ragged breaths. Adrenaline flooded my system. The forest I had once admired now became a treacherous labyrinth. Branches whipped my face. Roots nearly tripped me. I didn't dare run toward my campsite. That would be the first place they'd look. I just ran in the opposite direction, hoping to find the main road. The chase went on for I don't know how long. I had the advantage of having hiked in this forest for 2 days, while they seemed only familiar with their valley. I threw them off by running through a stream, erasing my tracks. I scrambled up a high rock outcropping and lay breathless in a narrow crevice. From below I could see figures moving past, phantoms in earth-toned cloaks, carrying torches. They searched methodically, silent and efficient. After they had passed, I waited a long while longer before daring to move. I was scratched all over, my clothes were torn, and my heart was still hammering in my chest. I didn't go back for my tent or anything else. I left it all behind. I just walked, stumbling through the night, using the stars for clumsy navigation. Dawn broke, painting the eastern sky pink. The light brought a sliver of hope, but also exposed my exhaustion. It took several more hours with the sun high in the sky before I found a dirt road. I walked like a sleepwalker, and by a stroke of luck, a ranger's pickup truck came on patrol. The ranger looked at me in astonishment. I tried to tell him everything about the settlement, about Davis, about the horrific ceremony. My voice was hoarse and disjointed. He listened with a skeptical expression, but still reported it over his radio. They organized a search. They searched for 2 days, but they found nothing. Perhaps they had hidden it, which was the most terrifying thought of all. My only proof was the camera still hanging around my neck. Most of the photos were perfect, capturing the beauty of autumn. But there was one last shot, blurry and out of focus, taken in the moment I stumbled while fleeing. In that photo, through the window frame, was a faint circle of people and the bright red glow of fire reflected in empty eyes. I survived, but Ashwood took a piece of me. I brought back to the city not just photos of autumn leaves, but also the memory of a cold fanaticism hiding deep within the most beautiful of woods. Sometimes, in the middle of a bustling crowd, I'll catch a glimpse of a spiral on an advertising poster, or a doodle on a wall. And every time, the cold of that night runs down my spine, a reminder that the world has dark corners that reason can never touch, and there are forests from which not everyone can return. I have always loved autumn, loved the way the air turns sharp and crisp, the way the sunlight slants in a honeyed gold through the dying leaves. Autumn has a sad beauty, a reminder that everything must end. As a photographer, I was obsessed with that fading beauty. It's why I rented this cabin, a tiny speck lost in the vast national forest, more than an hour's drive from the nearest town. I needed the quiet. I needed those colors. The first week was paradise. Every morning, I woke before dawn, bundled myself in layers, and walked into the woods, my camera and a thermos of hot coffee in tow. The mist hung low to the ground, silvering the rust-colored fallen leaves. There was nothing but the sound of the wind whispering through the bare branches and the crunch of my own footsteps on the forest floor. I took hundreds of photos, the sunrise painting the hills, a close-up of a lone mushroom on a rotting log, a small, glittering stream making its way over moss-covered rocks. When I returned to the cabin, I'd spend the afternoons editing, a warm fire crackling in the stone hearth. The solitude was perfect. It fed me. The change began subtly, so much so that I didn't register it at first. It was a Tuesday evening in my second week. I came back from shooting the sunset, my hands numb with cold. As I stepped inside, something felt off, just a vague sense. I hung my coat and went to the kitchen to boil water, and then I saw it. The coffee mug I'd used that morning, the one I was certain I had left upside down on the drying rack, was sitting upright on the counter next to the sink. I stood still for a moment. Maybe I'd forgotten. I must have. Human memory is flawed. I was tired and consumed by my desire for isolation. It was easy to convince myself it was my own mistake. I dismissed it. A few days later, I was hiking a trail I hadn't explored before. Deep in the woods, I found a small clearing with a large rock that looked like a natural throne. Resting on the rock was a small figure woven from twigs and vines. It was crude, almost childlike, but there was an intricacy to its construction that made me pause. It didn't look like something a hiker had casually left behind. It felt intentional. A shiver went down my spine, an uncomfortable feeling that I was trespassing somewhere I shouldn't be. I took a photo and hurried away, feeling as if I were being watched from between the trees. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old cabin was amplified. The wood contracting in the cold, a pine cone dropping on the roof. I kept thinking about the stick figure. It was silly, just a piece of rustic craft. But I couldn't shake the image from my mind. The next morning, when I opened the front door to take in the early air, my heart stopped. On the wooden step sat another figure, identical to the one I had seen in the forest. This was not a coincidence. This was not my imagination. Someone had been here. Someone had been standing right outside my door while I slept. Panic rose in my chest. I scrambled back inside, throwing the deadbolt. I ran through the rooms, checking every window, all locked tight. I felt like a fool. I should have been more careful. The solitude I craved had now become a trap. I tried to be rational. Maybe it was a prank by some local kids, though I couldn't imagine why they would come so far out. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Of course. I hadn't checked it in days. I went outside, trying to find a spot with reception, circling the cabin in vain. When I came back around to the front, I saw my tires. All 4 tires on my truck had been slashed, the cuts deep and clean. They sat completely flat against the hard-packed earth. I was going nowhere. A cold dread washed over me, more intense than the autumn air. I had no choice but to barricade myself in. I dragged a heavy bookshelf in front of the door. I closed all the curtains, plunging the cabin into a false, gloomy twilight. I sat in the armchair facing the cold fireplace, my camera clutched in my hands, though I knew it was useless as a weapon. The day passed with agonizing slowness. I didn't dare go outside. I ate cold food from cans, listening to every tiny sound. The silence of the forest was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, pregnant with awful possibilities. I pictured someone out there, watching, waiting. But for what? Night fell. I didn't turn on any lights. I just sat in the darkness, watching the thin slivers of moonlight that pierced the curtains. I must have dozed off because when I jerked awake, it was the middle of the night. The cabin was as cold as a tomb. A sound had woken me, a soft, rhythmic scratching on the wall behind me. I held my breath. The scratching stopped, then started again, this time at a different window. He was circling the house, testing it. I sat frozen, my body rigid with terror. This wasn't unpranked. I looked around the dark room. My eyes fell on the iron fire poker, resting by the hearth. It was heavy and solid. I rose silently, every step on the old floorboards an agony. I picked it up, feeling its cold weight in my hands. A loud thud came from the front door, as if someone had thrown their whole body against it. The wood groaned in protest. Then again, he was trying to break it down. The bookshelf shuddered with each impact. I backed away, my back against the cold wall, the poker held ready. I didn't scream. There was no one to hear. The panic had been replaced by a strange focus, a primal survival instinct. My mind was working with a terrible clarity. I was not going to die here. The door splintered. A hinge gave way with a sharp crack. I knew I only had seconds. I glanced toward the kitchen. There was a back door that led onto a small porch. It was the only way. I had no time to think. As the front door burst inward and a large silhouette squeezed past the toppled bookshelf, I sprinted for the kitchen. I didn't look back. I just heard the heavy footsteps behind me. I threw open the latch on the back door and burst out into the frigid night air. I vaulted over the porch railing, landed clumsily in the damp leaves, and ran. I ran into the blackness of the forest. Branches whipped at my face and arms. Roots snaked under the leaves like hidden tripwires. I stumbled and fell several times, scraping myself raw, but I got up and kept going. My lungs burned. I had no idea where I was going, only away from that cabin. Behind me, I could hear the crashing of broken branches. He was following. He was faster. He knew this forest better than I did. I ran on pure adrenaline, the pain a distant thing. The pale moonlight filtered through the sparse canopy, just enough to make out vague shapes. I saw a slope ahead, a steep hillside of rocks and scrub. Without thinking, I threw myself down it. I rolled and slid, loose rocks cutting at my skin. I came to a stop at the bottom in a shallow, dry creek bed, gasping for air. I lay still, listening. For a moment, there was only the wind. Then I heard him, at the top of the slope, pacing back and forth. He had lost me. I lay there for I don't know how long, shivering with cold and fear. Eventually, the sounds from above ceased. I waited another hour in absolute silence before I dared to move. My body ached, but I forced myself to my feet. I couldn't go back. I started walking, following the creek bed, hoping it would lead somewhere. Anywhere. I walked for the rest of the night. As the first light of dawn began to break, I saw it, an old dirt road. I had never felt such relief. I followed it, limping for hours. Around midday, I heard an engine. An old logging truck came around a bend. I stepped into the middle of the road and waved my arms. The driver, an old man with a weathered face, pulled over. He didn't ask many questions when he saw the state I was in. He just told me to climb in. When we got back to civilization, I called the police immediately. They went out to the cabin with me, this time with me not being alone. They found evidence. There were clear pry marks on a window frame, the faint impression of a large boot in the damp earth near the back porch. And most importantly, they confirmed the slash marks on my tires. There had clearly been an attacker, but that's all they had. No witnesses, no fingerprints. The forest was too vast to search effectively. The case went cold for lack of leads. They suggested it might have been a local hunter or a hermit disturbed by my presence. Just guesses. I never went back. I sold all my landscape photography equipment. I can't stand to be alone in nature anymore. Sometimes on a cold autumn night, when the wind howls between the city buildings, I still feel like I'm being watched. I survived, but the man who hunted me is still out there. And never knowing who he was or why he targeted me, that's the most terrifying thing of all.